The moment Sarah Mitchell realized the last wagon had disappeared over the distant ridge, leaving nothing but dust and silence in its wake, she understood that her entire world had just shattered into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. She stood alone in the vastness of Wyoming Territory, clutching her mother's worn shawl around her shoulders as the August sun beat down mercilessly. The year was 1872, and the wagon train she had traveled with from Missouri had abandoned her while she had wandered too far from camp searching for her missing locket near a creek bed. By the time she returned, frantic and out of breath, the caravan had already moved on. She had screamed until her throat felt raw, running after them until her legs gave out. But they never heard her cries over the rumble of wooden wheels and the bellowing of oxen. Now she sat on a sun-bleached rock, taking inventory of what she had. A canteen half full of water. The clothes on her back. A small knife her father had given her before he died of cholera 3 weeks into the journey. Her mother had passed 2 years prior back in Missouri, which was why Sarah had been traveling west with her uncle's family. But her uncle had never liked her much, had always seen her as a burden. Perhaps he had not noticed her absence. Perhaps he had noticed and simply kept moving. She was 22 years old, alone in a wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction, and she had no idea how to survive. The first day passed in a haze of disbelief and tears. She rationed her water carefully, remembering advice she had overheard from the wagon master. She tried to retrace the path back toward the creek, thinking she could at least have water, but everything looked the same in this rolling prairie land. Sagebrush and dried grass stretched to the horizon, interrupted occasionally by rocky outcroppings and distant mountains that seemed to mock her with their immovability. On the second day, her lips began to crack. Her canteen was empty. The sun seemed to grow hotter with each passing hour, and she fashioned a makeshift covering for her head using her shawl, though it provided little relief. She thought about her mother, about the little house they had shared in Missouri, about the life she had imagined for herself in Oregon. She had dreamed of opening a schoolhouse, of teaching children to read and write, of maybe finding a kind man to marry and building a life filled with simple joys. Now she would die here, and no one would ever know what became of her. By the third day, she could barely walk. Her tongue felt swollen in her mouth, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. She stumbled over the uneven ground, no longer sure if she was walking toward anything or simply walking to keep from lying down and giving up entirely. The heat was unbearable, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She did not hear the horse approach, did not see the rider until he was almost upon her, his shadow falling across her face as she lay crumpled in the dirt, too weak to even lift her head. "Ma'am." The voice was deep, concerned, and unmistakably real. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Strong hands lifted her, and she felt water touch her lips. Cool, blessed water. She tried to gulp it down, but the man pulled the canteen away. "Easy now," he said gently. "Just small sips, or you will make yourself sick." Sarah forced her eyes open and found herself looking into the most striking face she had ever seen. The man was perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and dark brown eyes that held genuine worry. His black hair was long enough to touch his collar, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, a leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that now lay on the ground beside them. "What happened to you?" he asked, giving her another small sip of water. "Wagon train," she managed to croak out. "They left me." His jaw tightened and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "They left you out here alone." She nodded weakly, and he cursed under his breath, though he seemed to catch himself and apologized immediately. "I am sorry, ma'am. That is just about the lowest thing I have ever heard." He studied her face carefully, then glanced at the sun's position in the sky. "Listen, I have a camp about 2 miles north of here. I have been tracking strays from my herd. Can you ride?" "I do not know," Sarah whispered honestly. "Well, we are going to find out because I cannot leave you here." He stood, scooping her up in his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, stood patiently nearby. With impressive skill, the cowboy managed to mount while still holding Sarah, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She slumped against his chest, too exhausted to feel embarrassed by the intimacy of their position. "My name is James," he said as they began to ride. "James Cartwright. What do I call you?" "Sarah," she managed. "Sarah Mitchell." "Well, Miss Sarah Mitchell, you just hold on, I am going to take care of you." She wanted to thank him, wanted to tell him that he had just saved her life, but darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid warmth of James's chest behind her lulled her into unconsciousness. When Sarah woke, she was lying on a bedroll inside a small canvas tent. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. She could hear a fire crackling outside and smell something cooking that made her stomach clench with hunger. She sat up slowly, testing her strength, and found that while she was still weak, the desperate thirst had been quenched. "You are awake," James said, ducking into the tent. He carried a tin cup filled with broth. "This is just beef broth, nothing fancy, but you need to get something in your stomach slowly. If you eat too much too fast after going without, it will make you ill." Sarah accepted the cup gratefully, cupping her hands around the warm metal. "Thank you," she said, her voice still raspy but stronger than before. "You saved my life." James settled down cross-legged near the tent opening, maintaining a respectful distance. "I only did what any decent person would do. Though I have got to say, I have seen some cold behavior in my time, but leaving a woman alone in the wilderness is beyond the pale." As Sarah sipped the broth, she studied her rescuer more carefully. In the warm light of sunset, she could see that his face was kind despite its weathered appearance. His hands were calloused and scarred from hard work, but they had been gentle when they handled her. He wore a gun on his hip, as most men did in this territory, but something about his bearing suggested he was not quick to violence. "Tell me what happened," James said. "If you are up to talking about it." Sarah told him the whole story, from her parents' deaths to traveling with her uncle's family, to the moment she realized she had been left behind. James listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. "Your uncle," he said when she finished. "What was his name?" "Thomas Mitchell. He was traveling with his wife Ruth and their 3 children. "Mitchell," James repeated thoughtfully. "I will remember that name. They were headed to Oregon." Sarah nodded. "There was talk of fertile land in the Willamette Valley. That is still weeks of travel from here, assuming they do not run into trouble." James shook his head. "The question now is what to do with you. I cannot take you back to your uncle even if I wanted to track them down, which would take days we do not have. My cattle outfit is working out of a ranch about 30 miles east of here. We have been gathering strays all summer, and I am due back in 4 days with whatever I can find." "A ranch?" Sarah asked, hope flickering in her chest. "The Double R, owned by Robert Richardson. He is a fair man, runs a decent operation. His wife Margaret might be willing to take you on as help around the house, at least until you figure out your next move." James paused, studying her face. "It is not Oregon, but it is a roof over your head and honest work." Tears stung Sarah's eyes. "I have no way to repay you for your kindness." "I am not asking for repayment," James said firmly. "Now finish that broth and get some rest. We will start riding at dawn. It will take us 3 days to reach the ranch, and we need to take it slow so you can build your strength back up." That night, Sarah lay in the tent listening to James moving around the camp outside. He sang softly to himself as he worked, old cowboy ballads that spoke of lonesome trails and distant homes. His voice was surprisingly good, rich and melodic, and she found herself soothed by the sound. For the first time in days, she felt safe. They set out at sunrise, Sarah riding behind James on his horse. She had protested that she could walk, but he had given her a look that brooked no argument. "You barely have the strength to stand," he had said. "We will ride together, and that is the end of it." As they traveled, James talked to her about the country they were passing through. He pointed out landmarks, identified plants and animals, and told her stories about his years working cattle in Wyoming Territory. He had been cowboying since he was 16, he said, having left his home in Texas after his parents died of fever. I drifted north following the herds, James explained. Worked on ranches in Kansas, Colorado, and finally ended up here 3 years ago. The Double R is the best outfit I have ever worked for. Robert treats his men fair, pays on time, and his wife runs the house with kindness. If you do end up working there, you will be treated well. You speak of them with real affection, Sarah observed. James nodded. They gave me a place when I needed one. Robert saw something in me beyond just another drifter cowboy. He taught me how to read beyond just my name, how to do figures. Said a man who wants to run his own place someday needs to know more than just how to rope and brand. You want your own ranch. Sarah asked. Someday, James said, and she could hear the longing in his voice. A small place, nothing fancy, just enough land to run a modest herd and maybe have a family. He paused, as if realizing he might have said too much. That is probably foolish dreaming for a man like me. I do not think it is foolish at all, Sarah said softly. Everyone should have dreams. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and Sarah found herself increasingly aware of the man in front of her. The strength in his back, the confident way he sat his horse, the occasional times when his hand would drop to cover hers where she held onto his waist, steadying her when the terrain grew rough. There was something fundamentally good about James Cartwright, something decent and true that shone through despite the hard edges that frontier life had given him. By midday, they stopped to rest near a small stream. James helped Sarah down from the horse and then proceeded to set up a simple camp. He was efficient in his movements, every action purposeful and practiced. Sarah watched him work and felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her recent ordeal. Here, James said, offering her strips of jerked beef and hardtack. It is not much, but it will keep your strength up. As they ate, Sarah asked, Do you ever get lonely, out here by yourself for weeks at a time? James considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted, but there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. Out here, I have the sky and the land and the work. That is usually enough. He glanced at her. Though I will admit it is nice to have someone to talk to for a change. I imagine the cows are not much for conversation, Sarah said with a small smile. James laughed, a warm sound that made Sarah's heart skip. No, ma'am, they surely are not. As they continued their journey over the next 2 days, something began to shift between them. The conversations grew longer and more personal. James told her about his childhood in Texas, about the brother he had lost to a rattlesnake bite when they were boys, about his dreams of building something lasting in this wild country. Sarah told him about her mother's love of reading, about how she had taught Sarah everything from Shakespeare to arithmetic, about the school she had hoped to open. You wanted to be a teacher, James said thoughtfully. There are not many schools out here. Plenty of ranch children who need educating. I have no supplies, Sarah pointed out. No books, no slate, nothing. Those things can be gotten, James said. If you have the will, the way can be found. On their second night of travel, they camped in a small canyon that offered shelter from the constant wind. James built up the fire and made a stew from dried vegetables and salt pork that tasted like heaven to Sarah after days of simple rations. As they ate, he told her about some of the characters who worked at the Double R. There is Old Pete, who claims he rode with mountain men back in the 30s. Nobody knows if it is true, but he tells a fine story. Then there is Cookie, who is the worst cook in the territory but will fight anyone who says so. And there is young Billy, who is only 18 but can ride anything with 4 legs. What about the Richardson family? Sarah asked. Robert is in his 50s, solid as they come. Margaret is maybe 45, and she runs that ranch house like a general runs an army, but with kindness. They have 2 grown sons who work the ranch and a daughter who got married last year to a rancher up north. James poked at the fire with a stick. "They are good people, Sarah. I promise you that." "I trust you," Sarah said, and realized as she spoke the words that they were absolutely true. Despite knowing this man for less than a week, despite the strange circumstances of their meeting, she trusted James Cartwright completely. James looked at her across the fire, and something passed between them in that moment, something electric and undeniable. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" He seemed to struggle with his words, which was unlike him. "I know we have only just met, and I know you have been through an ordeal, but I feel like I should be honest with you. These past couple of days, riding with you, talking with you, I have felt something that I have not felt before. You are smart and brave and kind, and when I look at you, I see someone I could build that dream with, that ranch, that life." He held up his hand as she started to speak. "I am not asking you for anything right now. I know you need time to recover, to figure out your own path. I just wanted you to know that my help is not just out of duty, it is because I care about what happens to you." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure James could hear it. "I have felt it too," she whispered. "I thought maybe I was being foolish, or that it was just gratitude for you saving me, but it is more than that. When I am with you, I feel like I have found something I did not even know I was looking for." James stood and moved around the fire to sit beside her. He took her hand carefully, as though she might break. "Then let us see where this goes," he said. "No promises, no pressure, just two people who found each other in the middle of nowhere and want to see what comes next." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. James lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, and the tenderness of the gesture made tears spring to her eyes. That night, Sarah lay in her bedroll with her heart full of emotions she could barely name. Fear and hope tangled together. Grief for what she had lost and excitement for what she might be finding. She had been abandoned in the wilderness, left to die, and instead she had found a man who looked at her like she was precious, who spoke to her like her thoughts and dreams mattered, who made her believe that maybe the worst thing that had ever happened to her might somehow lead to the best. They reached the Double R Ranch on the afternoon of the third day. It was a sprawling operation, bigger than Sarah had expected, with a large main house, several barns and outbuildings, and an extensive system of corrals. Cattle dotted the landscape in every direction, and Sarah could see several cowboys working with horses in a nearby pen. As they rode up to the main house, a tall man with graying hair emerged from the barn. His weathered face broke into a smile when he saw James. "Cartwright," he called. "About time you got back. We were starting to think you had decided to stay out there permanent." His smile faded when he saw Sarah. "Who is this?" James dismounted and helped Sarah down, keeping a supportive hand on her elbow. "Robert, this is Miss Sarah Mitchell. I found her 3 days ago, nearly dead from thirst. Her wagon train left her behind." Robert's expression turned thunderous. "Left her behind? What kind of people would do such a thing?" "The kind who do not deserve to be called family," James said grimly. "Sarah, this is Robert Richardson, owner of the Double R." "Sir," Sarah said, trying to stand straight despite her exhaustion. "I do not mean to impose. James thought perhaps your wife might have worked for me. I am willing to do anything, cooking, cleaning, laundry. I am a hard worker and I learn quickly." Robert studied her for a long moment, and Sarah felt herself being evaluated, then his expression softened. "Any woman who survives being abandoned in the wilderness has backbone. Come inside and meet Margaret. We will figure something out." Margaret Richardson was a plump, motherly woman with kind eyes and capable hands. When she heard Sarah's story, she immediately took charge, bustling Sarah off to a spare room, insisting she take a real bath and put on clean clothes. "We will burn those rags you are wearing," Margaret declared, eyeing Sarah's trail-stained dress with disapproval. "You are about the same size as my daughter was. We have trunks full of her old things that she did not take with her when she married." The bath was pure heaven, and the clean clothes felt like a luxury Sarah had forgotten existed. When she emerged from the room, Margaret fed her a proper meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from the garden. Sarah ate slowly, mindful of James's warning about making herself sick, but every bite tasted like a miracle. Over dinner, Margaret and Robert discussed Sarah's situation. James sat quietly, but Sarah noticed him watching her with concern. "You can stay in the spare room," Margaret announced. "In exchange, you will help me around the house. Cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, that sort of thing. We can discuss wages once we see how things work out." "Does that sound fair?" "More than fair," Sarah said, relief washing over her. "Thank you so much, both of you." Robert nodded. "We help our own out here. That is how people survive in this country, by looking out for each other." After dinner, James walked Sarah out to the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. They stood side by side, not touching but close enough that Sarah could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You will be safe here," James said quietly. "Margaret and Robert are as good as their word." "When will I see you again?" Sarah asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of her voice. James smiled. "I live in the bunkhouse with the other hands. I will see you every day, Sarah. I am not going anywhere." True to his word, James was there the next morning when Sarah emerged from the house to help Margaret with breakfast for the ranch hands. He gave her a warm smile that made her heart flutter, and as the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself falling more deeply in love with the quiet cowboy who had saved her life. She settled into the rhythm of ranch life quickly. Margaret was a patient teacher, and Sarah learned how to manage a household on the frontier, from rendering lard to making soap to preserving vegetables for the winter. The work was hard but satisfying, and she loved the feeling of being useful, of earning her keep. James found excuses to be near the house whenever his work allowed. He brought her wildflowers he found while checking fence lines. He taught her how to ride properly on one of the gentle horses from the ranch string. On Sunday afternoons, when the ranch work slowed, they would walk together along the creek that ran through the property, talking about everything and nothing. One Sunday, about 6 weeks after Sarah's arrival, James took her to a spot on the creek where cottonwood trees provided shade and the water ran clear over smooth stones. They sat on a fallen log, their shoulders touching, watching the water flow past. "I have been thinking," James said, his voice slightly nervous, "about what I want from my life." "And what do you want?" Sarah asked, though her heart was already racing because she thought she knew what he was going to say. James took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I want you," he said simply. "I want to marry you, Sarah. I know we have not known each other long, but out here people do not wait around forever. Life is uncertain. When you find something good, you hold on to it." He turned to face her fully. "I love you. I think I have loved you since that first day when you looked up at me with those determined eyes, refusing to give up even though you were half dead. I want to build that ranch I told you about, and I want to build it with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and come home to you every night. I want to have children with you and grow old with you and make a life that means something." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, James, I will marry you. I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes. You gave me back my life and now I want to share it with you." James cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle at first and then with growing passion. Sarah kissed him back, pouring all her love and hope and dreams into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. "We should talk to Robert and Margaret," James said, grinning like a boy. "And we need to figure out when and where to get married. The nearest preacher is in town, about 15 miles south." They practically ran back to the ranch house, hand in hand, laughing like children. Margaret took one look at their faces and let out a whoop of joy. "Finally," she exclaimed. "I have been watching you two dance around each other for weeks. Robert, get out here. James and Sarah are getting married." Robert emerged from his study, took in the scene, and smiled broadly. "About time, Cartwright. I was starting to think you would never work up the nerve to ask her." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in town. Sarah wore a dress that Margaret had altered from her daughter's wedding gown, a beautiful creation of ivory, silk, and lace. James wore his best shirt and a new vest he had purchased in town, and when he saw Sarah walking toward him down the aisle, his eyes grew suspiciously bright. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Robert and Margaret stood as witnesses, along with several of the ranch hands who had become Sarah's friends. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed Sarah with such tenderness that several people in the small congregation dabbed at their eyes. Robert and Margaret gave them a wedding gift that took their breath away. A small plot of land on the edge of the Double R property, about 200 acres with a creek running through it and good grazing. "You can run your cattle with ours until you build up your own herd," Robert said gruffly, obviously moved by their gratitude. "And I expect you to keep working for me, Cartwright, at least until you get established. Consider this a partnership." "I do not know what to say," James managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Say you will build something good here," Margaret said, hugging them both. "Say you will be happy. That is all the thanks we need." James and Sarah moved into a small cabin on their land that the ranch hands helped them build during the autumn. It was rough and simple, just 2 rooms and a loft, but to Sarah it was a palace. She made curtains from flour sacks and cooked their meals on the cast-iron stove that James bought in town. At night, they lay together in their bed, talking about their dreams for the future. "Next spring, we will start building up the herd," James said one night, his arm around Sarah as she rested her head on his chest. "Robert said he would give us a good price on some breeding stock. In a few years, we could have a real operation going. And maybe by then we will have a child to help with the work," Sarah said softly. James went still. "Sarah, are you saying what I think you are saying?" She nodded, unable to keep the smile from her face. "I am expecting a baby, James, in the spring." James let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around the small cabin until they were both dizzy and laughing. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be a family." Their son was born in late April, delivered by Margaret with James pacing anxiously outside the cabin. When Margaret finally called him in, James entered to find Sarah exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Meet your son," Sarah said softly. James approached slowly as though afraid he might break something and looked down at the tiny red face peeking out from the blanket. "He is so small," he whispered. "He is perfect," Sarah said. "What should we name him?" "Thomas," James said without hesitation, "after my brother who died." "And Mitchell for his middle name after your family name, the part of it worth keeping." "Thomas Mitchell Cartwright," Sarah said, trying out the name. "I like it." As Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, the ranch prospered. James proved to have a natural gift for ranching, and their small herd grew steadily. They added rooms to the cabin, transforming it into a proper house. Sarah started teaching Thomas his letters, and word spread among the neighboring ranches. Soon, other families were asking if she would teach their children as well. 2 years after Thomas was born, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after the woman who had given them both so much. 2 years after that, another son arrived, Robert James Cartwright. Their house rang with laughter and noise, and sometimes Sarah would stop in the middle of her day and marvel at the life she had built. One evening, when Thomas was 7, Margaret was 5, and little Robert was 3, Sarah stood on the porch of their house watching her children play in the yard while James worked with a young horse in the corral. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and pink. James finished with the horse and walked over to the porch, wiping sweat from his brow. He climbed the steps and stood beside Sarah, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I am thinking about that day you found me," Sarah said. "When I thought my life was over and you rode up and said those words." "Ride with me," James said quietly. "That is what I said, and you have been riding with me ever since." Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "I was left behind by people who were supposed to care for me. I thought it was the worst thing that could ever happen, but it brought me to you. It brought me to this life, these children, this home. I would not change a single thing. Not even the terror and the thirst and nearly dying." James asked, though he was smiling. "Not even that," Sarah said firmly, "because it led me here, to you, to us." James kissed her, slow and deep, the kind of kiss that still made her knees weak after all these years. When they broke apart, Thomas was making exaggerated gagging noises while Margaret giggled, and little Robert tried to figure out what was so funny. "Come on, you rascals," James called to the children. "Time to help your mother with dinner." The children ran shrieking toward the house, and James and Sarah followed more slowly, their hands linked, their shoulders touching. Inside, the house was warm and bright, filled with the sounds of family and life and love. As Sarah prepared dinner with her children helping and hindering in equal measure, she thought about the wagon train that had left her behind, about her uncle who had not cared enough to notice she was missing. She wondered sometimes where they had ended up, if they had made it to Oregon, if they had found what they were looking for. She hoped they had in a distant kind of way, but mostly she did not think about them at all, because she had found everything she needed right here. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Sarah and James sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. The air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of prairie grass and sage. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Taking me in that day, you could have had a simpler life." James laughed softly. "Simpler maybe, but not better, never better." He pulled her closer. "You gave me everything I ever wanted, Sarah, a home, a family, someone to build dreams with. That day I found you was the luckiest day of my life." "Mine too," Sarah whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the gentle sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and one of their horses answered with a soft whinny. Inside the house, Sarah could hear one of the children turning over in bed, the creak of old wood, the ticking of the clock James had bought her last Christmas. These were the sounds of her life, the life she had built from nothing with the man who had seen her at her lowest moment and offered her everything. The wagon train had left her behind, but that abandonment had led her to something far better than she could have ever imagined. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Thomas grew into a strong, responsible young man who loved working the ranch with his father. Margaret proved to have her mother's mind for learning and her father's way with horses. Robert was the dreamer of the family, always coming up with wild schemes and grand plans that made his parents laugh and shake their heads. James and Sarah added 2 more children to their family, twin girls they named Catherine and Elizabeth. The house was always full of noise and activity, and Sarah often ran a small school right from her kitchen table, teaching not just her own children but the sons and daughters of neighboring ranchers. When Thomas was 18, a young woman named Emma came west with her family to homestead nearby land. Sarah watched her eldest son fall in love with the same helpless intensity that she had fallen for James, and she gave him the same advice her own mother had once given her: when you find the right person, hold on tight and never let go. Thomas and Emma married the following spring, and James helped them build a house on another section of their growing ranch. Sarah became a grandmother at 43, weeping with joy when she held Thomas and Emma's son for the first time. Margaret announced at 19 that she wanted to go east to college, that she wanted to become a doctor. James was uncertain, worried about his daughter traveling so far from home, but Sarah supported her daughter's dream with fierce pride. They scraped together the money for tuition, and Margaret left for medical school with their blessing and their love. Robert surprised everyone by showing a talent for business, and by the time he was 21, he was managing the financial side of the ranch operations, negotiating with buyers and investing their profits wisely. The ranch that had started as 200 acres and a handful of cattle had grown into one of the most prosperous operations in the territory. The years were not without sorrow. They lost old Pete to pneumonia one harsh winter, and Sarah grieved for the old man who had become like a grandfather to her children. They lost cattle to disease and drought and harsh winters. Margaret Richardson passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72, and Sarah wept for the woman who had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. But the joys far outweighed the sorrows. Sarah stood beside James as Wyoming became a state in 1890, proud to be part of the first state to grant women the right to vote. She cast her ballot with tears in her eyes, thinking of her mother who had taught her that a woman's mind was just as valuable as a man's. She watched her children grow and flourish, each one finding their own path in life. Thomas and Emma gave her 5 grandchildren. Margaret returned from medical school with her degree and opened a practice in the nearest town, becoming one of the first female doctors in Wyoming. She married a fellow physician, a kind man who respected her intelligence and ambition, and they had 3 children who called Sarah and James their favorite grandparents. Robert married a schoolteacher named Alice, who was as practical and clever as he was, and they had 4 children who were already showing signs of their father's head for business and their mother's love of learning. Catherine and Elizabeth, the twins, opened a dress shop in town that became famous throughout the territory for the quality and style of their work. Through it all, through every triumph and setback, every joy and sorrow, James and Sarah rode together. They were partners in every sense of the word, building not just a ranch but a legacy, a family, a life that mattered. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house that had started as a simple 2-room cabin had grown into a sprawling structure with multiple wings and additions, each one marking a different stage of their life together. The ranch now covered several thousand acres, and the Cartwright name was known throughout Wyoming as a brand of quality and integrity. Sarah stood on the porch watching her family mill about the yard, children running and playing, adults talking and laughing, and felt a sense of profound contentment. She was 52 years old, her hair was streaked with gray, and there were lines on her face that had not been there 30 years ago. But when James came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, she felt exactly the same as she had at 22. "What are you thinking about?" He asked, the same question he had asked her 1,000 times over the years. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Sarah said, leaning back against him. "I am thinking about that day in the wilderness when I thought my life was over and how wrong I was. My life was just beginning." James turned her in his arms to face him. His hair was gray now too, and his face was deeply lined from years of sun and wind, but his eyes were the same warm brown that had captured her heart 3 decades ago. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah Cartwright. I thank God every day that I found you." "I thank God that you said those 3 words," Sarah replied. "Ride with me, best invitation I ever accepted." James kissed her, and their children and grandchildren cheered and applauded, the younger ones making the same exaggerated gagging noises that Thomas had made as a child. Sarah laughed against James's mouth, happier than she had ever imagined possible. As the sun set on their anniversary celebration, as their family gathered around the long tables laden with food, as the children played and the adults told stories, and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Sarah looked around at everything they had built and felt a peace that went bone deep. She had been left behind, abandoned and alone in the wilderness. But that abandonment had led her to this, to James, to their children and grandchildren, to this ranch and this life and this love that had sustained her through everything. She had been left behind, but she had been found by exactly the right person at exactly the right time. And when that cowboy had said, "Ride with me," she had said yes. And she had been riding with him ever since, through every sunrise and sunset, through every storm and calm, through every moment of their life together. Years later, when they were both old and gray and surrounded by great-grandchildren, someone would ask Sarah about her journey west, about being left behind by the wagon train. And she would smile and take James's weathered hand in hers and say the same thing she always said. "I thought I had been abandoned. I thought my story was ending. But really, it was just beginning. Because the very next day, a cowboy found me, and he said, 'Ride with me,' and I have been riding with him ever since." And every single time, James would lift her hand to his lips and kiss it gently. And they would share a look that spoke of 30, 40, 50 years of love and partnership, and a life well lived together. Their children would roll their eyes good-naturedly at their parents' romance, but secretly they would be grateful. Because James and Sarah had shown them what real love looked like: steady, faithful, passionate, and true. A love that could weather any storm, overcome any obstacle, and build something lasting and beautiful from the hardest of beginnings. Sarah and James grew old together on their ranch, surrounded by the family they had built and the life they had created. And when Sarah passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, James held her hand and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for riding with me, Sarah. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for this beautiful life." And though Sarah could not answer, James knew in his heart that she heard him, that she knew, that their love story, which had begun with an abandonment and a rescue in the Wyoming wilderness, had been everything they had ever dreamed of and more. James lived another 3 years after Sarah's passing, cared for by their large and loving family. He spent his final years sitting on the porch of the house they had built together, watching his grandchildren and great-grandchildren play in the yard, telling stories about the woman he had found in the wilderness and how she had changed his life forever. When James finally passed at the age of 84, he was buried beside Sarah on a hill overlooking their ranch. Their children placed a single headstone over both graves with an inscription that summed up their entire life together. She was left behind. He found her and said, "Ride with me." And so they rode together through all the days of their lives. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passed down from parent to child, each generation adding their own chapter to the story. But everyone who lived there knew the beginning, knew the story of how their family had started with an abandonment and a rescue, with a cowboy who had offered his hand, and a woman brave enough to take it. And on quiet evenings, when the sun was setting over the Wyoming mountains and the wind was whispering through the grass, people said you could almost hear it. The sound of 2 horses riding together across the endless prairie, 2 souls bound together by love and fate and the simple words that had started it all. Ride with me, and she had, and they had built everything together, and it had been beautiful.